Five Nights at Freddy's has concocted some wicked-looking designs over the years. Animatronics with melted smiles, rows of teeth, empty eye sockets, and occasionally a body or two shoved inside. And if you've been perusing the FNAF merchandise or the character encyclopedia, there's a chance you've stumbled across these strange cousins to the nightmares and were confused if they were some version of the nightmares. And in a way, you'd be partially right. These are the Twisted Animatronics, and appropriately, the story surrounding them isn't exactly the easiest to follow. The Twisted Animatronics are by far one of the strangest examples of animatronics in Five Nights at Freddy's, both in what they are in lore, and the fact that they are book-exclusive animatronics that became very heavily displayed in merch for a while. But nothing about them is stranger than their backstory. So, what are the Twisted Animatronics? The Twisted Animatronics are the titular main threat in the book The Twisted Ones, the sequel to the Silver Eyes, and the second in the Silver Eyes trilogy. They are a group of 4 animatronics built by William Afton, made to use illusion disc technology to disguise themselves. They are at their base mannequin models and then use the illusion discs to trick the brains of humans close enough to hear the noise they emit into seeing them as something else. It's heavily implied that they were made to work in a restaurant, where children expecting to see Freddy and the gang would have had their minds fill in the illusion technology and see lifelike characters instead of the mannequins. That being said, they are significantly larger than the original Freddy animatronics. Remember that for later. Illusion discs are somewhat overly complicated, and their use seems to bend depending on what part of the plot they're involved with. But in this case, when you're expecting to see something, the illusion discs will make you see that, while experiencing headaches, nausea, and general dysfunction. And because Charlie and her gang expect to see monsters, when the Twisted Animatronics activate, they resemble monstrous creatures instead of the mascots they were initially supposed to replicate. In fact, the reason they are called the Twisted Ones is due to their shifting appearance, where they seem blurry and will flitter in and out between mannequin and beast. That being said, the situation with what the animatronics actually look like is sort of confusing on its own. See, I'm sure you've seen the graphic novel designs, or seeing the graphic novel designs as I'm showing them to you, and the merch designs, but that's not what the Twisted Ones actually look like. And no, I don't just mean that they normally look like round, simplistic suits, which they do. They're covered in like a squishy sort of faux skin material. They're pale, smooth, lacking animal details, and it's mentioned that it's sort of hard to tell the characters apart at first glance, as upon looking at deactivated Twisted Foxy, it takes Charlie a moment to deduce that it is Foxy. This could also be because he has a patchy face, like part of his covering was removed. This is what they primarily look like when the illusion discs are off, and when they're buried in the ground, this is the form they take. But what I really mean is, the book is kind of dodgy on what the Twisted Ones actually look like. And I mean, I just reread the book to make sure, and there's a surprisingly small amount of detail on these things. In fact, it doesn't really describe them at all. It describes the mannequins in details, but their twisted designs, no. Twisted Freddy is mentioned as having brown fur in his top hat, rolling eyes, a button nose, and giant, flabby, bouncy cheeks. But then very quickly devolves into having a python-like mouth that slides around looking to suck up prey. I believe they call it sinuous once or twice. In the merchant graphic novel, Twisted Freddy does have a pretty large mouth with a very anus-like inner sphincter. But the tumors on his body, his claws, his hideous appearance, none of that matches. In fact, he lacks the giant flabby cheeks too. In the book, it really seems like Twisted Freddy looks like a Freddy, a freakish Freddy, but a Freddy. But he's not necessarily described as being monstrous beyond the python thing. And as well, graphic novel Twisted Freddy is lacking a long neck. Twisted Wolf is described as looking like a misshapen figure morphing in and out between wolf and metal framework, with piercing blue eyes and a silver wolf mane. Eventually it settles on a metal appearance of some kind, making Twisted Wolf not only the most detailed Twisted one, but the only one who distinctly looks like his merch and graphic novel counterpart, who is a silver wolf with blue eyes, half animatronic and half real. Twisted Bonnie is described as being misshapen with a head too large for its body, white hot glowing eyes, and several rows of gleaming teeth. Graphic novel Bonnie does have multiple rows of teeth and extra jaws, but the book doesn't describe him as having like mandibles, or these gaping holes and curled claws. However, in the book, Twisted Bonnie does get burned and partially melted, so maybe that's a reference to that. Foxy is mentioned as having blurry skin and fur, flickering like a trick of the light, and partially glowing. But in the graphic novel and merch, Twisted Foxy is shown to have multiple layers of teeth, long claws, a glowing red eye, and a long hook attached to a hole-filled stump. He's garish and gross, while the book Foxy isn't even described to have a hook at all. In hindsight, the Twisted Animatronics are barely described at all. The fake house Charlie crashes in for a few minutes before she's kidnapped was described in more detail than these guys. The graphic novel designs are way better than just leaving these characters to be blurs through the entire book, but this leaves yet another thing to be confusing about these characters. And is another reason why the graphic novel is superior to the original novel, alongside the padding, repetition, and also the repetition. But moving on. Now, it's pretty obvious that Afton made these animatronics to kill kids initially, and they seem to be a book stand-in for the Fun Times before the Fun Times got brought back a book later. But somehow they ended up buried underneath Henry's house. The most likely option being that he got a hold of them somehow, figured out what William was doing, and buried them himself in the hope that no one would ever find them. Unfortunately, a storm causes Henry's house to get trashed, and the Twisted Ones get free, upon which William Afton, who is now Springtrap, uses his choreography implants in his suit and is somehow able to tap into the Twisted Ones miles away and coerces them into freeing themselves and going after Charlie Emily, Henry's daughter. He also planned on having them free him, but Charlie and her friend Jessica ended up freeing him by finding his body, which the cops somehow completely missed. But this clarifies one thing, and that's that the Twisted Animatronics have little intelligence, if not backed up by the fact that one of them, Twisted Foxy, gets stuck under the floor and just stays there. They might be similar to the Fun Times, but they're not like the Fun Times. They are merely puppets for William Afton, and they are very dangerous to humans. They can take out humans easily, but when it comes to other animatronics, a group of old, smelly, moldy animatronics from the 80s can body them in no time flat. Now, how these things hunt humans is simple. They bury themselves during the day to not be detected, and then at night they crawl free and prowl. And when they find someone to target, they pull them inside their body where they have a built-in springlock mechanism. They are basically a walking springlock suit, though not built to be worn, only built to seal and kill. And they can kill an adult pretty quickly before dumping the body and moving on, racking up a few victims in a short amount of time. Victims that resemble Charlie Emily. Well, at least in the book, they seem to be going after people who look like Charlie Emily, but there's really only one girl that's mentioned who looks like her, and at one point they also kill a guy. Before we get into that, let's actually go through every one of the Twisted Animatronics. Twisted Freddy is the most important of the Twisted Ones due to his contributions in the book, being the animatronic who captures Charlie and then captures her again and kills her later. Twisted Freddy is one of the 3 animatronics running amok killing people, though we don't know if he killed any of the previous victims for sure. His first real appearance is when Charlie is crashing in a show house, trying to lure the Twisted Ones to her under the belief that instead of killing her, they would take her somewhere and reveal the answer of what happened to her twin brother, Sammy. Why she thought this? Pure delusion. While laying on a bed waiting for them, Twisted Freddy sneaks in and comes up to the foot, where he then comes over the edge of the bed and using his python mouth sucks her up inside. Charlie is then transported inside of Twisted Freddy, who is able to roll his eyes back to look at her, until he makes it to the underground pizzeria, where he then buries himself. She gets herself free and climbs out and explores the pizzeria, only for Twisted Freddy to follow and ambush her in a side room. She manages to kick herself free and escapes, only for him to get shot by Clay, which breaks his illusion disc and shuts him down. Despite this, he gets up and starts fighting during the big rumble, and then after this, he appears at the very end of the book while the house is collapsing and quickly yanks Charlie inside of himself and begins to seal himself up to trap Charlie forever. Charlie's friends try to get her out, set off the Springlocks, and she is assumedly killed. Later on, and the details are kind of vague, but either Aunt Jen got her out there, or Twisted Freddy got dumped in a scrapyard and Aunt Jen got her out there, and assumedly Freddy's remains are just around somewhere because valiant Police Chief Clay Burke sucks at his job. Twisted Freddy has no other dominant personality trait other than his persistence and desire to devour, similar to the others. Next is Twisted Foxy. Twisted Foxy is technically the first of the Twisted Ones who Charlie goes up against in the book, as she finds him trapped in the basement of her house, whereas the others escaped. Half embedded in the ground, Charlie approaches to examine him and accidentally wakes him up, leading to Foxy trying to grab her and pull her in to his chest. John then easily rips Twisted Foxy's head off, a fact both hilarious and that I totally forgot despite having just read the book. So later, when I talk like Twisted Foxy isn't doing anything, assume that I both forgot about the head thing and that I'm talking in a more generalized sense of could have been used further. The important part is that Charlie gets an illusion disc from him that she's able to use to continue her research into what's going on. And after that, Twisted Foxy is never seen again. It's kind of funny, actually. Twisted Foxy is in the room where Charlie gets killed, so instead of having John miraculously rip his head off, they could have had him spring and kill Charlie instead of having Twisted Freddy run in at the last second. Always such an attention seeker, that guy. Twisted Wolf is the first wolf animatronic and the replacement for Chica. We'll get into that later. He's another traveling Twisted, but we first see him when Charlie, Clay, Jessica, and John are staking out an apartment complex. While most of the inhabitants were evacuated, one woman was not, and Charlie catches sight of the Twisted Wolf trapping her inside of it on the tree line. However, upon getting spotted, Twisted Wolf drops the woman and bolts for it. The woman ends up surviving, but is real beat up. Later on, Twisted Wolf tag teams with Twisted Bonnie, and they hunt Charlie and her friends, mostly her friends, in the underground pizzeria. While crossing an artificial river covered in gasoline, Clay sets them on fire, where their exterior mostly melts away. But Twisted Wolf and Bonnie continue pursuing them until the classics show up, upon which Twisted Wolf is pretty much decimated by Foxy in no time flat. The irony that Twisted Foxy couldn't even get up on his own and classic Foxy took out arguably the most threatening Twisted one on his own, for the most part, is incredible. Also, Twisted Wolf is the only one of the Twisted ones to make it into the mainline games, though as a cameo on both accounts, seen on a poster in the alleyway in Pizzeria Simulator, and as one of Toy Chica's crushes in Toy Chica's high school years. Now you might notice something familiar about the Twisted Wolf, and yes, interesting fact, but if we look at the timing and influence, and FNAF wolves in general, Twisted Wolf is the predecessor to Roxanne Wolf. Not in the lore specifically, but in the outside narrative, Twisted Wolf came out before Roxy, and his design somewhat inspired her earliest iteration in Freddy in Space. So yeah, he would count as a Roxy variant. And if we take in the story additions added in Secret of the Mimic into account, we can say that William Afton based the Twisted Wolf off of Deadeye Roxy, a long-forgotten root beer mascot who he likely claimed the rights for after his harsh takeover of Murray's Costume Manor. That being said, there's few if any similarities between Twisted Wolf and Roxanne Wolf, save that they are silver wolves. Roxy's female, Twisted Wolf is male, Roxy is a proper mascot, Twisted Wolf is just an unnamed wolf, yellow eyes, blue eyes, high fashion in the buff. He's like an early primal build. But despite being arguably the most interesting one, his story ends there. Moving on to Twisted Bonnie, I sort of inadvertently told his story already. He doesn't appear until the underground pizzeria where he and Twisted Wolf tag team together. He gets set on fire, and then gets set upon by classic Bonnie and Chica, upon which he has zero chance and gets given an early grave. Rip the rabbit. And finally, we have Twisted Chica. Now, Twisted Chica is the craziest twisted one here, and that's because she doesn't exist. Yes, despite the merch, despite the 2 pages in the character encyclopedia, Twisted Chica simply isn't in the book beyond Charlie thinking about the possibility that maybe she exists. Though unlike Bonnie, who her speculation was correct about, for whatever reason, Twisted Chica was entirely replaced by the Twisted Wolf. But then, she still made it into the merch line. Her design is pretty interesting, having a big toothy mouth on her face and belly, a torn bib and claws and even spurs, and a little bit of pink eyeshadow. Cute. But what's absolutely hilarious here is that Twisted Chica, despite not being in the book, is still inaccurate to the book. Charlie wonders about a Twisted Chica clutching a cupcake, but instead Twisted Chica has cupcake-shaped growths stuck to her cheek and side. A fact pointed out in the character encyclopedia book, but a bit of irony nonetheless. So that's all of the Twisted ones, and as far as their story going forward, well, I covered most of it. They wake up, dug themselves out, became Afton's zombie puppets, got totally nailed by the classic animatronics, and then likely ended up in a trash heap. So they don't sound like these real big deals, do they? And if that's the case, why'd they get so much merch about them? Well, funny story, but I don't know. But I have some suspicions. Now, before I start, we have to go over something weird I found out along the way, and that involves the actual release date of the Twisted Ones merchandise. Our first piece of merch that we'll be looking at will be the minifigure set that features the Twisted Ones in it. Now, what's strange is that on the wiki, it says that this is Series 3, but online elsewhere, it says that Series 3 is supposedly the sister location line, and it released in 2017. On the wiki, it says that the sister location line was Series 2, and the Twisted Ones minifigures actually released in 2018. And after cross-checking this with the Ella Funko Pop, I can say with most certainty that the Twisted Ones line of merch came out in early 2018, about about after the book released, and 3 years before the graphic novel came out. Now, this seems a little strange to me. You might notice that most FNAF merch comes out pretty closely after whatever game or whatever such comes out. It's planned in advance, which is why Security Breach merch came out before the games, and the only reason things sort of slowed down afterwards was because of the switch out from Funko. That's part of the reason why we don't have much Secret of the Mimic merch now, and that's because of that swapping of the production brands, and also because the figure line right now is focusing on the movie merchandise with their new Indo figures. So that all aside, why did this take so long? And more importantly, why did a book without even the Twisted Ones on the cover, this was the original cover, create so much merch? Well, there were posters in the book with some. Well, let's cover the merch and then I'll tell you my crackpot theory. The mystery minifigures have Twisted Freddy, Bonnie, Foxy, Wolf, and Chica. And other Silver Eyes characters such as Charlie's Toys, Theodore, Stanley, and Ella, and a spring-locked looking Afton. But the rest of the set is a mismatch of random characters left off from other series. We have Jacko Bonnie, Yendo, Nightmare, Request for Fast Fix, or Shadow Bonnie, the Paper Pals, Bon Bon and Bonnet, a second really cool innard who I do not have, those 2 dolls from the sister location office, Lolbit, and Dark Springtrap, the cutscene exclusive Springtrap. When you look at it like this, it seems like the Twisted Ones were shoved into a line with a bunch of random characters yoinked from the games who weren't in a line before. Series 3 is a little piecemeal. Odd, but understandable enough. There likely weren't enough Twisted Ones characters to make figures out of unless they did the human characters, which they didn't start doing until Gregory and Vanessa. Next, there was a line of plush toys. They're cute enough, but lose some of their intricate detailing. Notably, Twisted Foxy's plush is his only version that's not half buried in the ground. There's also Funko Pops of the line. Noticeably, Twisted Bonnie looks blue as he does in his minifigure, while he looks purple in his plush and on his poster. Peculiar. There's also various apparel items such as a Twisted Freddy beanie, a Twisted Wolf shirt, and a Twisted Foxy Bio World TV pen. This one I've seen at Hot Topic. I have not seen the other two. They're probably at Hot Topic. Also, weirdly, early versions of the FNAF Monopoly had the Twisted Ones on the cover instead of the normal Freddy gang, for some baffling reason. Why have the book-exclusive animatronics who less people are likely to identify with on the shelf? Nowadays, it seems like they switched to having Freddy on the cover totally, but I actually have the version with the Twisted Ones in it, crazy enough. And even funnier still, FNAF Monopoly, instead of buying locations, you buy animatronics, which is actually really neat, except the Twisted Ones aren't in the lineup at all, which makes the fact that they're on the cover even stranger. I feel like I'm missing something, like there's something else that I totally forgot about that they were on, but I can't remember what it was, so moving on. Remember when that clown FNAF line came out and everyone thought it was merch exclusive, but then the Stickerpedia revealed that there was like a canceled game that would have starred them? Well, turns out that there was a merch exclusive line hiding under our noses this whole time. And that's the Twisted Ones. Well, in a sense. From what I've gathered, the original posters and the designs did release at the same time as the Twisted Ones book, despite not showing up much. So there's absolute evidence that the Twisted Ones did have their merch design at that point. But what happened with the Twisted Ones after that basically turned them into merch characters first and foremost, and a good chunk of time after the book came out. Sort of. And I don't think the merch was delayed. Remember, they didn't really make much merch for the books. Even until this day, there still hasn't been much merch based off of the books. So, what I think is that they were used for the merch to fill in a gap in Funko's production line. Funko was the one who was notorious for recolors such as the tie-dyes and cheese trap. But instead of recolors, they used these book character designs that had previously only been spotted in a handful of rare posters. In fact, unless I'm wrong, I think it was after this that recolors became frequent. One thing odd that I did find out that I should mention, and this isn't like a hint towards anything, I just find this weird, is that on the wiki, apparently Pinky made a prototype Twisted Chica, and apparently it was recent enough to the merch that Funko started making a Twisted Chica pop out of that design before settling on a different one. What that could mean is maybe Twisted Chica's design was made later, or maybe the pops were in production for a long while. I don't know, maybe Funko just got the wrong design. But there is something I brushed upon shortly ago. The posters were sold with the book. Or at least there was a Freddy one sold with the book. I think the posters were just floating around. At the same time, so why don't the description of the books and the designs match? I mean, this happens a lot in FNAF, but this seems like a bigger deal than with Fazbear Frights, since back then, this was like the second FNAF book of the original trilogy. It was considered a pretty big deal. I mean, it was a really big deal, because within the next year, major book characters would be revealed to be game characters. So, this was a deal. So why not make those details precise? So here's my crackpot theory. Again. And that's that the book designs were so lacking in description that the artist was given the go-ahead to take creative liberties, and they did so. There we go. That's it. So that's the Twisted Ones. Nightmarish, toothy creatures using illusions to hunt and stalk in an underground location owned by Afton. Okay, time for the Orville elephant in the room. Having just read the book, again, rereading, and taking all of this into consideration with fresh eyes, including how the animatronics are described, the Twisted Animatronics are Nightmare Animatronics. And I don't necessarily mean they're a copy of the Nightmare Animatronics. I straight up think that there's a chance that the Twisted Animatronics were just the Nightmares in another name and another design. If not because Nightmare is on the cover, then for things like the illusions over animatronics. In case you don't know, Nightmare himself is an illusion over an endoskeleton. Sister Locations maps say that the locations in the FNAF 4 minigames are actually observation rooms, some of which are hidden underground, like the underground pizzeria rooms in the book. And that William Afton is behind it, surveying the whole thing. Nightmare Fredbear's line,
"This time, There is more than an illusion to fear.
That illusion is very on the nose. All this together, yeah, it feels like the Twisted Ones are just the book versions of the nightmares. And it is very possible as well that the light descriptions were because, FNAF tends to keep details vague when it comes to concrete lore. Especially around FNAF 4, that lore's locked up tighter than a dummy case. I know that goes against the whole Twisted Ones posters being distinct, but that would explain why the book doesn't describe them much anyways. They either were the nightmares or basically are stand-ins for them, I don't know. Or, maybe since Ultimate Custom Night and the Illusion line came after this, the nightmares and the Twisted Ones were separated and have in hindsight been formed into the same, or a similar concept. Who knows? But what do I think about the Twisted Ones? Well, it depends. If we're talking about the original novel, the Twisted Ones are kind of a letdown due to their lack of description and easy defeat at the hands of the classics, who themselves were easily shocked, kicked, and tackled by Charlie and her friends. The Twisted Ones are felt in the book, but not really in it. Like I said, Foxy and Bonnie are limited to a singular encounter, one of which is not really rectified. And this actually matches the main antagonist, Springtrap, as well, as he appears at the very end of the book, makes some cryptic comments, gets utterly wrecked by Charlie, and then scurries away with them planning to fight him another day like he's bloody Team Rocket or something. And really, that's not on the Twisted Ones, it's on the Twisted Ones. But if we're talking about the designs outside of the book though, they're actually pretty effective. They really worked for merch designs. I mean, the plushies weren't much to write home about, but the minifigs are really neat looking. Really, the draw of the Twisted Ones aren't their gimmicks, their illusions, or any of that. It is these garish, gross designs, which take on Nightmare's rows of teeth and crank them up a bit, with tumors and stretchy bits and Freddy's wormy mouth. And in that case, it works. They really do work, and to be honest, it's kind of a shame that the Twisted Ones weren't limited to a book, because these designs would have been really cool in something else. But since they were stuck in this book where they weren't even really described, we really didn't get the full use out of this cool design. But at least got some really neat merch. And really, that's the case that matters, since if you didn't read the Twisted Ones, your experience with them is probably through that merch alone, of which there was a pretty good amount of it. But that's their twisted story. Will we ever see them again? Odds are no, unless it's in a retrospective or there's a Silver Eyes game like Into the Pit, or maybe as a cameo in either. But being as their book exclusives instead of game characters, and their primary rivals, the Nightmares, are very popular, I don't foresee it happening. Alas, it looks like these twisted ghouls will be staying buried for a while longer yet. Maybe someday to be dug up with other remnants of FNAF's lengthy history. But for now, 6 feet under and 8 years behind us. Rest in peace, Anus Freddy. Thank you for watching.